Good morning. Welcome. Welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. Agnostics, skeptics, and anyone who's just curious, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural talked about from the podium. So we are founded on shared belief in scientific naturalism and secular ethics. But the talk that I'm going to give today does not represent any official position of the Seattle Atheist Church, which is pretty much always the case, that our talk is just to get the conversation started after the talk. So today I'm talking about Carl Jung and his work. I'm also going to talk about the shadow and the collective unconscious. And so, yeah, we'll see if we have some good stuff to stimulate some conversation out of it. So Carl Jung was a Swiss psychologist that was born in 1875, and he is the founder of analytic psychology. He is known for some very familiar concepts, such as archetype, the collective unconscious, complex, synchronicity, extroversion and introversion, and other things that you would be familiar with. This is a guy who's writing about them. So extroversion and extroversion are basically two words for the same thing. I looked it up to see what the difference was, but it said that he just liked to say extroversion for some reason. So in analytic psychology, the individual takes the opposites that exist within their own personality and integrates them into a whole personality. And he called this process individuation. So the process is complicated by the fact that most people are unconscious of many aspects of their personalities. And so he thought that the subconscious was a place of healing, where you could go to look for beneficial insights. And he was interested in the subconscious mind, and that conscious attempts to access and assimilate the information in our subconscious was a worthwhile pursuit. So he employed what he called active imaginations to see what his subconscious would show him. So active imaginations is a method for assimilating unconscious content through self-expression, such as writing and painting. So being aware of your dreams, being aware of any intuitions or sensations, and then processing it by writing about it and by painting about it. And from 1913 to 1919, he took a very strange experiment and deliberately cultivated his irrational side. He set aside time every day to do this. And he called it practicing psychosis and practicing schizophrenia. So obviously he wasn't having a true psychosis or schizophrenia, because if he were having psychosis, he'd be losing control of his mind. But he was up to something where he was trying to access his subconscious and then trying to process it by writing about it and by creating art. He was doing a lot of painting. And so he was writing and painting what his visions and all of that in a red leather journal, which eventually became known as the Red Book. So during his lifetime, he never allowed the Red Book to be published. And in fact, his heirs didn't allow it to be published until 6 years ago. And this book, the footnotes in this book, which have been from the editor, there's over 1,000 footnotes explaining all of the references in this book. So in his life, Jung knew a lot about myth and folklore and comparative religions, and he had access to what his clients were coming in and they were telling him their dreams. And so he was trying to take in all of this information and he was processing it. He did write something called the 7 Sermons for the Dead during this time. It was partly inspired by some of the stuff that he was thinking about in his Red Book. So, of course, he ended up imagining all kinds of weird things. But I do think that the willingness to look into his subconscious this way is actually a really brave thing. It was a really honest and brave thing. It was certainly a unique thing. And so one of the questions I had was, do I take it for granted that the subconscious is filled with rich source material, or is it something to simply be afraid of? So, talking about the significance of what the Red Book contained, Jung was unequivocal. He said, all of my works, all of my creative activity, he would recall later, has come from those initial fantasies and dreams. And then one of his clients later also wrote a book, and she recalled Jung's advice for processing what went on in her mind. And she said, I should advise you to put it all down as beautifully as you can in some beautifully bound book. It will seem as if you are making the visions banal, but you need to do that. Then you are freed from the power of them. Then when these things are in some precious book, you can go to the book and turn over the pages, and for you it will be your church, the silent place of your spirit where you will find renewal. So he thought, obviously, that there was a lot to value in terms of those things inside that you might even be afraid of, right? The scary dreams. And so I just thought that was interesting as even a really short process, trying to connect with one's subconscious in this way. And so I wanted to contrast this extreme of Jung, who's really interested in what's going on in his subconscious, with a character who's completely out of touch with her subconscious, right? Because I think there is some fear that there's like madness in that direction. But the claim that I'm making is really there's madness in the other direction if you're too afraid to think about what's going on inside of yourself. So does anyone remember a character called the Joyologist from Saturday Night Live from about 1998? My worst fear, nobody remembers the Joyologist. Well, Helen Madding had a character who was a joyologist. And whatever topic was being discussed, she would shout, I love it, I love it, I love it! And the character was nuts, basically. And you would be completely afraid of this character if you met her in real life, in the first place because she was completely manic, right? She was really woo up here, right? She was, and but also because being out of touch with the aspects of ourselves which are sad, which are angry, dissatisfied, or awkward, or whatever, is also a really dangerous place to be. Like, that's not a whole person. And thinking about this topic is of personal significance to me because I was, for part of my religious education, I was raised in New Age churches. So I got the best of both. I got fundamentalism and I got New Age churches. And in a New Age church, you will often hear that you attract to yourself whatever you think about and whatever you feel. And so that's why I love the character of the joyologist, because she decided she was just going to be feeling joy all the time. And the person who does that essentially is nuts. And the parts of yourself that you refuse to think about are the parts that you're doomed to trip over in the dark. So Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the dark conscious. So I'm not suggesting you make an identity out of the hurt places, but that you bring the hurt places into the light and you integrate them into a larger personality that includes everything that is true about you. The hurt places are part of us, and the heroic places are part of us too. So Jung said that unless you learn to confront your shadows, you will see them in others, because the outside world is a reflection of the world inside of you. And so this isn't just simply what you see in other people, but really what triggers you. So whatever triggers you is an aspect of your own self that you projected out onto somebody else. Wikipedia says that psychological projection, which is also known as blame shifting, is a theory that says we defend ourselves against unpleasant impulses by denying their existence in ourselves while attributing them to others. So a person who's rude may constantly accuse other people of being rude, right? I'm never rude, but I have the experience that everybody else in my life is rude. And so let's take a moment and kind of consider what kind of people trigger your emotional alarm system. Is it someone who acts childish? Is it someone who's pompous or arrogant? A goody two-shoes? Someone who is loud? Someone who is a rebel? So whoever meant, or even for that matter, I had someone took me to lunch recently and said that it used to be true that whenever somebody would mention a book she hadn't read, that it would make her feel uncomfortable, right? Because there's that repressed part of herself that feels she should have all the answers. And probably the truth is she is obviously intellectually curious or whatever, or else the thing wouldn't even be a trigger for her, right? And but whatever makes you feel reactive, look to it for clues to see if there's something about yourself that you're denying. And Jung said that the best political, social, and spiritual work that we can do is to withdraw our projections from others. And how do we withdraw our projection from others? And so that's the work of becoming more aware of ourselves, right? So we all have personas, and the persona is another idea from Jung, that we use to conceal our true nature from others. And this allows us both to function in society and also to degree a certain amount of privacy, right? That I can be a certain way with this group of people and a certain way with a different group of people. And so the first step is just kind of notice where the knobs are for you, which knobs do you turn. So you might get a little more erudite in certain situations, a little more folksy in others, as Josh would say, a little more Jersey. So depending on your background. But you want to look that if there's something you're concealing from yourself, that's your shadow. So if you're concealing it from other people and you're kind of aware of that, that's just a persona that you're working. But when you're actually concealing parts of yourself from yourself, now that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about shadow. And your shadow self is not always negative, okay? So you might find that you might, depending on what your job or your situation is, you might have to stuff some of your compassion into your shadow, or men might some of their tenderness into their shadow or whatever. The shadow's not always negative. And your shadow has different layers of it. So you have your own personal layer, and at the deepest layer, there is a collective unconscious layer of our shadow. The collective unconscious is a shadow shared among all people in a society, or actually in societies, in the whole, in the species really. And it can direct the self using archetypes and dreams. So the human collective unconscious is populated by archetypes. In strict terms, the archetype is the underlying form from which the image springs, but in common usage, we call the images themselves the archetypes. So in addition to archetypal characters, Jung includes archetypal events such as birth, death, the quest, and archetypal images such as the flood, the tree of life, or mountains. And if you Google the phrase stock characters, you find about 100 examples that could be considered archetypes. Something about their personality defines their character. And so I'm going to give some archetypes, and you just see who comes to mind, right? Action hero. So Indiana Jones, Lara Croft type. Angry white male. Archie Bunker. Does anybody remember Archie Bunker? The competitive underdog. So that's Rocky Balboa or Maggie Fitzgerald, and she's the character from $1 Million Baby, the boxing movie. Crime fighter that uses logic. Sherlock Holmes, Monk. Seems like they all have to use logic these days. The gentle giant, and that would be Chewbacca or Hodor. And then finally, spoiled children. And the iconic spoiled children are Veruca Salt from whatever that movie is, Willy Wonka, and Dudley Dursley from Harry Potter. Okay, now I brought in 4 archetypes which I found on a website called Soulcraft. And if you recognize one of these archetypes as reflective of yourself, I want you to think about how it plays out in your life. I'm just going to do 4 of them. But notice that an archetype's fears are the exact opposite of their goals. Okay? And Jung believed that one thing that can happen to you is that you lose momentum when you get faced with your fear, if you're not prepared to integrate that in as part of, if you deny that you have that fear. Okay, just being able to say like, and that's what I fear the most, can help you get perspective and stay energized. Okay, so the altruist, whose motto is, I love my neighbor as myself. The core desire is to protect and care for others, and the goal is to help others. But the greatest fear is that of being selfish. And the sage, whose motto is, the truth will set you free, whose core desire is to find the truth, and whose goal is to use intelligence and analysis to understand the world. But his biggest fear is to be duped, confused, or misunderstood. The creator, whose motto is, if I can imagine it, it can be done, whose core desire is to create a thing of enduring value, and whose goal is to realize a vision. But the biggest fear is mediocrity, mediocre execution. And finally, the rebel, whose motto is, rules are made to be broken, whose core desire is to effect change, and whose goal is to overturn what isn't working, but whose greatest fear is to be powerless. So we can think about ourselves, in terms of these archetypes, we can think about ourselves in this kind of impersonal way, which allows us to see things with enough distance, and we can look at those aspects of ourselves without flinching. So it's sort of like if you are a person who is an altruist, to think of yourself as selfish might be so painful that you can't even do it. Or if you're a person who's a creative visionary, to think that actually what you produced is pretty mediocre, it might be something that you like can't even deal with thinking about it. So a thing that people can do is to embrace the opposite as a way of acknowledging your shadow and integrating it. So say something like, I want to help others, and sometimes I'm selfish. I want to make sense of the world, and sometimes I'm unclear. I want to create something of value, sometimes I'm mediocre. I want to overturn what doesn't work, but sometimes I'm powerless. So the goal is to integrate the shadow, because the opposite is to basically battle against reality, which is exhausting. Face your shadow to integrate the aspects of your personality and accept yourself as all the qualities you perceive to be positive and all the qualities you perceive to be negative. Because if you can integrate the aspects of your personality, you can experience a strengthening of the positive qualities. So the 5th century philosopher Heraclitus said, the road up and the road down are the same thing. And what he meant by that was that a thing can often change into its opposite. He was talking about physical opposites, but consider it as a metaphor for the fact that aspects of the personality have the opposites contained within them. And if you go too far in one direction, you might go too far in the other direction. It's a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of thing. Jung called this enantiodromia. I might be mispronouncing that. But the key here is that you want to look for the middle way where you can stand in the middle and see both the positive and the negative of any aspect. And from there, you are able to be more consistently good. And so there's all kinds of things that I then thought of, perhaps saying, like, we're an atheist church, there's a place to grow in reason as opposed to faith. We celebrate logos here, but I want to make sure that we also are trying to find a middle way where we're thinking, but we're also engaging our emotions. So if not in church, at least I would put out there, like, make some time to have, to let yourself be emotional. I think sometimes people who are very rational can be afraid of letting themselves be emotional. And for good reason, right? Because I asked, what are you afraid of? And it was like, well, I know what people are afraid of. But the idea here is to be a whole person. We want to embrace both of these aspects. So I will close the way I always do with something I like to say, which is that atheists believe in good because good works in non-mysterious ways. Thank you.